Christmas, a time to come together and be merry, a time of new beginnings and hope, unless it's Wuthering Heights. In this case, Emily Bronte uses the reader's pre existing image of the holiday to represent, subvert, and illuminate the themes of her Gothic masterpiece. Chapter 7 of Wuthering Heights opens with a line Kathy stayed at Freshcross Grange 5 weeks, till Christmas. Shortly after, we were informed by Nellie that she's preparing for Christmas, as they are expecting the Lintons to spend Christmas Eve with them. For the first time, we were given an exact date. Why? Why does Emily Bronte choose to let us know it's Christmas time when she has mostly left it vague, giving us a rough season at most? It is, in my opinion, that it's important for us to unpack why she chose Christmas. After all, she was previously a poet. Thus, she would have an understanding of word economy and the use of symbolism that help carry her themes. Bronte is also far from the first to use the holiday to represent something. Shakespeare used the holiday in a handful of his plays, including The Twelfth Night. In the tale of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, one of the Arthurian legends, a Christmas celebration is essential for staging the approaching adventure, not to mention future tales such as A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens and The Chronicles of Narnia. It is in my belief that Emily Bronte uses the reader's pre-existing stereotypes around the holiday to help create expectations only for the story to divert it, but to also use these ideas and beliefs surrounding the holiday to support a couple of her themes. For example, the transition from childhood to adulthood, gentrification, and the idea versus reality of being a good Christian. Before I dig into what I believe Emily Bronte is trying to say, let us take a step back to look at what Christmas looked like at this moment in history and then unpack what the holiday represents. I just want to make a quick aside. If you keep seeing my eyes drift down, it's because I spent the time to write a script. Every now and then I write an actual essay, and I want to make sure I'm reading it as close to how I wrote it because I wrote it well enough that it makes sense and I'm not missing anything. So, yeah, I would love to just read this off to you, but I feel like I need to engage a little bit more. So, I'm trying to do a little bit of both. So, I apologize if you do see my eyes drifting. The history of Christmas. For this section, I am very appreciative of the research done by Judith Bailey Slagle, who posted the article called Where is Christmas in 18th Century British Literature? How the Puritans Changed Christmas on the website The 18th Century Common. The reason I appreciate this article is because it gives us an understanding of what the holiday looked like leading up to and during the 18th century, which happens to be the same era Wuthering Heights takes place. More specifically, this chapter takes place during the Christmas of 1777. We can surmise this thanks to what Nellie says to Lockwood at the end of the chapter. However, if I am to follow my story in the true gossip's fashion, I had better go on, and instead of leaping 3 years, I will be content to pass to the next summer, the summer of 1778, that is nearly 23 years ago. And even though Emily Bronte is considered a Victorian writer, since she did write this book within that era, which started in 1837 and Bronte died in 1848, Bronte's childhood, like Christmases, would have taken place prior to all the traditions implemented by Queen Victoria. Most likely, it looked more akin to the style mentioned in the above article and the brief mentions in Wuthering Heights. Celebrations of Christmases have been mentioned in British literature for centuries. Some of the earliest references mention some in a manner that combines Christian and pagan elements, from winter solstice celebrations that included decking the halls with holly and evergreen and caroling. Starting around the Tudor and Stuart era of England, aka roughly between the late 1400s to the early 1700s, began the tradition of the 12 days of Christmases. This was not quite like the song we know today. Rather, it was the traditional lavish hospitality of English country houses, occurring between December 24th through to January 6th, a festive period in which lords and ladies offered generous food, drink like wassail or mulled wine, and open access to tenants, neighbors, and even wandering groups, embodying an open house policy where welcoming all guests was paramount. This was a practice rooted in historical customs that strengthened the ties between the lords and their tenantry and community. However, this tradition would have been cut off thanks to Cromwell's government banning Christmas celebrations in 1644, not to return into the Restoration in 1660. At the same time, Simon Carter from the Jeffrey Museum argues that the Puritans disapproved of Christmas for what it had become, an excuse of insobriety, gluttony, and gambling. Extreme Protestants also believe that there was no justification for the celebration of Christmas in the scripture. Both influences changed the holiday celebrations that would shape how people in the 18th century Britain kept Christmas, resulting in rather a colorless, more restrained holiday that would not transform significantly until late in the century and early in the 19th. The article I read also referenced Julie Ratcliffe's British Library website entitled An 18th Century Christmas, as it provided as many literary references to the holiday as was possible during this time. It is a feat since it was very sparsely recorded thanks to the culture of the time. However, through her work, Radcliffe have been able to affirm that although Christmases throughout the long 18th century meant lean time for the poor, as most work stopped for the holidays without pay to workers, more benevolent landowners provided them with gifts of money and food. Wealthy and poor alike, she continues, decorated their homes with greenery, ivy, mistletoe, and herbs, including rosemary and bay. People reunited and played games, wassailers sang carols, and theaters even performed plays, all remnants of pagan times and winter solstice celebrations, as were the colors red and green. As religion was still rather prevalent during this time, it was rather impossible to avoid ministers advocating charity from their pulpits. Many preached to inspire affluent Britons to focus on holiday goodwill. In some works, it became evident that charity events became associated with the 18th century Christmas holidays, even gaining momentum in its popularity during the century. While many of the traditions of Christmas celebrations stem from pagan roots, the 18th century upper classes might have deliberately shunned such riotous events such as the Twelfth Night festivities to present a more cultured and enlightened front. Still, Christmas boxes or the monetary gifts from the lords were not only expected, but larger amounts were demanded by servants and tradesmen. And since Restoration, England had to recover from the Puritans' ban on Christmas under Cromwell's long dictatorship, apprehensive families may have simply abandoned these earlier Christmas traditions. Over the course of the century, the holiday traditions went through a transitional period, moving away from the ultra conservative Puritan ideas and into a family structured way of celebrating. By the end of the 1700s and into the 1800s, we can see a segue into the traditions we are more familiar with that were first introduced and hyped by the Victorians, but they were inspired by such works such as Jane Austen. In a handful of her novels, she associated the holiday with snow, food, and seasonal balls, a time of coming together and being charitable. However, we also see how this transition introduces a refinement to the traditions that one could argue feels not too dissimilar to the colonization we will come to see throughout the course of the Victorian era. The spreading of a very exacting image of what society should look like at the cost of cultural history. What does Christmas represent? Not to give you all flashbacks to English class, but let's dig into the symbolism of Christmas. The reason why I want to do this and why your teachers encourage you to do this is because once it was less common for books and movies to hold your hand and tell you exactly what they're trying to get across. Instead, they would use stereotypes and pre existing sentiments to help convey a deeper theme. It doesn't need to be super lofty like the symbolism of candlestick, it can be as simple as Christmas. Take a moment and describe Christmas. Did you describe it with words such as family, community, cheer, charity, giving, or warmth? So, if you were to read or hear a scene is set during Christmas, your mind is already painting a picture of what it would most likely look like, sound like, and feel like. We have a baseline expectation thanks to our experiences, culture, and tales shared with us. Good authors then use these expectations to contextualize and illustrate the themes or the conversations they are trying to have with us. In literature, it's not uncommon to find Christmas used as a catalyst for change. The holiday setting often prompts characters to confront their flaws and embody virtues, or to be used as a reinforcement of traditions by showcasing such traditions like caroling, feasting, or giving, making them culturally significant. Another is to use Christmas as a bridge between worlds. It connects the mundane world with magical, spiritual, or fantastical. Think like the Polar Express or the Chronicles of Narnia. But within or in addition to that, there are a handful of common themes that the idea of Christmas represents, especially in literature. One such theme is redemption and transformation. This may not be your first thought when you think of Christmas, but most likely you're very familiar with The Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, a tale of Scrooge undergoing a profound moral/spiritual change, moving from selfishness or despair to kindness and hope. All this mirroring the Christian narrative of salvation. It also sort of makes sense if you think of the Western calendar and when our New Year's falls, New Year, New You. In addition, there is the long held symbolism of winter being connected to death or the end of something, but the cycle of nature shows that the next stage should be birth or rebirth. It's a time of change. And because of everything else surrounding Christmas, the event acts as a sort of catalyst for change. In the case of Wuthering Heights, Kathy returns home after 5 weeks with the Lintons around Christmas time, and with this quote describing her. By that time, her ankle was thoroughly cured and her manners much improved. It appears as though Kathy has drastically changed from the savage child into a poised young lady, giving hope to some of the other members of her household. It is as though Kathy has been transformed and redeemed just in time for Christmas. A more obvious theme around Christmas is generosity and goodwill, an emphasis on charity, selflessness, and sharing with the less fortunate, often highlighted through feasting and gift giving. There's a lot I plan on digging into in regards to this theme in Wuthering Heights, but for the moment, I wish to share this one quote from chapter 7 that I believe embodies this theme. And then I remembered how old Earnshaw used to come in when we all were tidied and call me a cunt lass and slip a shilling into my hand as a Christmas box. And from that I went on to think of his fondness for Heathcliff and his dread lest he should suffer neglect after death had removed him. And that naturally led me to consider the poor lad's situation now, and from singing I changed my mind to crying. It struck me soon, however, there would be more sense in endeavoring to repair some of his wrongs than shedding tears over them. It also makes sense that community and connection is considered a theme of Christmas. Literature often uses it to explore the human need for togetherness, family bonds, and a collective collaboration or celebration against loneliness. Over the course of chapter 7, we see this desire felt even more strongly with The Holiday by Nellie and Heathcliff, who are pushed away. It is evident with Nellie making comments such as, I prepare to sit down and amuse myself by singing carols all alone, and under these circumstances I remain solitary. But it is more apparent with Heathcliff when Nellie says, they had invited them to spend the morrow on Wuthering Heights, and the invitation had been accepted on one condition. Mrs. Linton begged that her darlings might be kept carefully apart from that naughty, swearing boy. Finally, Christmas is also often used to illustrate childhood wonder and innocence. Tapping into nostalgia, magic, and the purity of belief, it is used to contrast adult cynicism. This is another theme that I will dig much more into in the next section. Nonetheless, there is one quote from chapter 7 that captures the theme with Nellie saying this to Heathcliff. And now that we're done washing and combing and sulking, tell me whether you don't think yourself rather handsome. I'll tell you I do. You're fit for a prince in disguise. Who knows but your father was Emperor of China and your mother an Indian queen, each of them able to buy up with 1 week's income, Wuthering Heights and Fresh Cross Grange together. And you were kidnapped by wicked sailors and brought to England. Were I in your place, I would frame high notions of my birth, and the thought of what I was should give me courage and dignity to support the oppressions of a little farmer. Going into my next section, you will see how these four themes will play a role and converse with the themes that I'm picking up from Wuthering Heights. With that, let us finally get into what I think Emily Bronte is trying to say by setting chapter 7 during Christmas. Christmas at Wuthering Heights. It's a new day, hence a new outfit, and also it is early in the morning, and that's why the lighting's different, even though like using natural lighting, it's still too early, and also it's snowing, so it's very dark and overcast right now, which is very fitting for what we're about to talk about. The fact an entire chapter of Wuthering Heights is set around Christmas, when the vast majority of the book is left vague, almost timeless, leads me to believe that there's a reason behind this decision. Although Wuthering Heights it was Emily Bronte's only novel, She had written numerous poems, with nearly 200 discovered and possibly more destroyed posthumously. Some critics argue that her poems are her stronger works. But what I'm trying to get at is that Emily Bronte would be familiar with the weight of words, to use them to their fullest extent thanks to the limited real estate in poetry, to use pre existing sentiments around words, phrases, images, places, or events to aid in vocalizing what she is trying to say. Hence, why I believe she uses the weight of Christmas to help illustrate her themes. In result, this chapter becomes a microcosmic illustration of the transition between childhood and adulthood, of gentrification, and the idea versus reality of what it is to be a good Christian. The fraught transformation into adulthood. It is so easy to forget how much of Wuthering Heights takes place while the characters are adolescents. We can thank movies for gaslighting us into picturing the characters as older than they are. To forget that Kathy was 18 or 19 when she died, already a wife and a mother. We are not told outright that Kathy is on the cusp or in the midst of puberty during the time that chapter 7 occurs, though we are told that she is 12 in the previous chapter. Nevertheless, what occurs during the chapter shows that transition from childhood into adulthood. We see it with this description of Kathy after being away for 5 weeks. So that instead of a wild, hatless little savage jumping into the house and rushing to squeeze us all breathless, they are lighted from a handsome black pony, a very dignified person, with brown ringlets falling from the cover of a feathered beaver, and a long cloth habit which she was obliged to hold up with both hands that she might sail in. Henley lifted her from her horse, exclaimed delightedly, "Why, Kathy, you are quite a beauty. I should scarcely have known you. You look like a lady now." As I previously mentioned, this hits on the Christmas themes of redemption and transformation, or it's used to be a catalyst for change. For it is not only outwardly that Kathy has changed. Besides the fine clothes and the perfectly coiled hair, her actions have changed. Gone was the girl that Nellie once described as a child that put us all past our patience 50 times and oftener in a day. From the hour she came downstairs to the hour she went to bed, we had not a minute's security that she wouldn't be in mischief. Her spirits were always a high water mark, her tongue always going, singing, laughing, and plaguing everybody who would not do the same. In her place is a version in which, while her eyes sparkled joyfully when the dogs came bounding up to welcome her, she dared hardly touch them lest they should fawn upon her splendid garments. She kissed me gently. I was all flour making the Christmas cakes, and it would not have done to give me a hug. Almost as though Kathy has been replaced by a changeling. She was near unrecognizable as Nellie assumed Heathcliff's spots. On beholding such a bright, graceful damsel enter the house, instead of a rough-headed counterpart of himself. Kathy's transformation comes across as almost magical. Between one page and the next, Kathy converts from a wild shoeless girl into an elegantly dressed lady that glides into the house, almost as if by magic a la Cinderella. This creates this fairy tale-esque sensation that touches on the childhood wonder and innocence theme of Christmas I previously mentioned. The sensation most likely is because we are not privy to exactly how this change came about. We do not see the potentially harsh reality of what was done to make this possible. Was it manipulation, gaslighting, coercion? Perhaps if we did know exactly how, it would be too real. The magical limitlessness of childhood torn by the limitedness of adulthood. Or perhaps Hindley's wife Frances and the Lintons were able to sway with simply the allure of fine clothes and flattery. Think back to your own childhood, to how we used to imagine what adulthood would look like, with childlike imaginings that we would buy all the things we wanted and live in our dream homes and eat dessert when we wanted and stay up all night, all to eventually face at least some form of cynicism, to discover we are not as free as we thought we would be. That is exactly what Kathy is going through as this chapter begins to demonstrate to her that she will not be allowed to have it all. She gets her first taste of how this new world she is stepping into will not allow her to bring Heathcliff along, as he is kept to the shadows upon her return and later violently banished from the Christmas celebrations. She does not even realize yet how these fine clothes she is enjoying constrains her, as evident with how she was obliged to hold up with both hands that she might sail in. And while us modern readers may not exactly experience Kathy's transition into a genteel, marriageable young lady, we can relate to how awkward and confusing this time of our lives can be. The desire to act like an adult is evident when Nellie describes how Kathy sat up late, having a world of things to order for the reception of her new friends, versus the instinct to fall back on childhood patterns. When the carolers came, Kathy, who loved music too, said to Nellie that it sounded sweetest at the top of the stairs, and she went up in the dark. An action that feels more akin to what a child would do, sneaking away from the party and playing hostess to listen to music at the top of the stairs. How many of us would spend a few minutes or maybe an hour play acting at like we were one of the adults at a family party only to eventually sneak away? Besides our own eternal back and forth, we experience it with other figures in our lives, being told to act like an adult only to be called a child in the next moment. As we see done when Hindley says to Catherine, Edgar, and Linton, "There, children, to your seats." We can see Kathy struggling with this during dinner when Nellie says, I waited behind her chair and was pained to behold Catherine, with dry eyes and an indifferent air, commence cutting up the wing of a goose before her. An unfeeling child, I thought to myself, how lightly she dismisses her old playmate's troubles. I could not have imagined her to be so selfish. She lifted a mouthful to her lips, then she set it down again. Her cheeks flushed, and the tears gushed over them. She slipped her fork to the floor and hastily dived under the cloth to conceal her emotions. I did not call her unfeeling long, for I perceived she was in purgatory throughout the day and were wary to find an opportunity of getting by herself or paying a visit to Heathcliff, who had been locked up by the master, as I discovered on endeavoring to introduce to him a private mess of victuals. In that moment, we are witnesses to her struggling to act like an adult, to be poised and reserved as she was being taught to be, to suppress her emotions. This too would be too much for any of us at that age, filled with so much emotions and hormones. But it's even worse for Kathy when we think back to an earlier chapter and how Natalie once described as someone whose emotions you knew readily. If she was happy, everyone was happy. If she was mad, everyone suffered for it. Now suddenly she is being forced to suppress her emotions, to suppress and change this part of her. And Heathcliff is the physical manifestation of her childhood that she's being pulled away from, the version of herself prior to this transformation. With Kathy's transformation, we are also given a first stepping stone into the conversation about class and gentrification when Frances says, but she must mind and not grow wild again here, alluding to Kathy having once been akin to savage, another description many others would use for Heathcliff, but also that possibly Frances sees Wuthering Heights as uncivil. Christmas, a harbinger of gentrification. Okay, calling Christmas a harbinger of gentrification is a bit extreme. However, as we see in Chapter 7 of Wuthering Heights, the holiday does offer the perfect scenario to spread and convert, especially since the holiday is known for its community and connection. While changes have been made to the life at Wuthering Heights since Hindley became master of the house, it is not truly felt until Christmas. For example, Nellie tells us in an earlier chapter of the household's banishments to far-off rooms upon Hindley's return, Kathy and Heathcliff to the attics rooms or the moors to avoid lectures and punishments, Nellie and Joseph to the kitchens and other far-off rooms. Whereas before they all used to convene in the main room at night, situated around the hearth, to read scriptures or work quietly, but together. This was the first sign of gentrification. After Hindley had spent the previous 3 years in the South at school with other young gentlemen, where he would have learned and seen the differences in their cultures, despite living within the same country. For us Americans, it is equivalent to how different we can be in culture from state to state, even bordering ones. But another book that showcases the cultural difference is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. The author is not only a friend of Emily's older sister Charlotte, even writing one of her biographies, but her story is sort of a Victorian fan fiction of Pride and Prejudice. She uses the same bold personalities and quick prejudices and wounded prides, but weaves it around the cultural differences between those who live in the South, such as in London or Oxford, versus those who live in manufacturing cities in the north. In Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte more so uses the Lintons and fresh-crossed Grange as the embodiment of Southern culture and how it's encroaching and changing Northern cultures and homes. Our first glimpse of it is in the previous chapter when Kathy and Heathcliff snuck over and peered into their home. Both of us were able to look in by standing on the basement and clinging to the ledge, and we saw, it was beautiful. A splendid place carpeted with crimson and crimson covered chairs and tables, and a pure white ceiling bordered by gold, a shower of glass drops hanging in silver chains from the center and shimmering with little soft tapers. Old Mr. and Mrs. Linton were not there. Edgar and his sister had it entirely to themselves. Shouldn't they have been happy? We should have thought ourselves in heaven. Whereas Wuthering Heights is described as fussed by Lockwood. One stop brought us into the family sitting room, without any introductory lobby or passage. They call it here the house, preeminently. Includes kitchens and parlor generally, but I believe at Wuthering Heights the kitchen is forced to retreat altogether into another quarter. At least I distinguish a chatter of tongues and the clatter of culinary utensils deep within, and I observe no signs of roasting, boiling, or baking about the huge fireplace, nor any glitter or copper saucepans and tin colanders on the walls. The floor was smooth, white stone, the chairs high-backed, primitive structures painted green, one or two heavy black ones lurking in the shade. The apartment and furniture would have been nothing extraordinary as belonging to a homely northern farmer with a stubborn countenance and a stalwart limbs set out to advantage in knee breeches and gaiters. Once, living at Wuthering Heights would have been considered rich. To own such a big property with materials strong enough to withstand the elements, most likely Wuthering Heights would have been considered a manor house or a Renaissance country house that were being built during the 16th century. We know from Lockwood that the year 1500 is etched above the door. Still, both would have been where the lord or landed gentry resided, with space to assemble their tenants, such as with a great hall, a space to hold manual court, aka preside over the law. Once it had not been uncommon to have many coming and going and staying within your walls. Think even farther back to the Odyssey. It comes to my mind since I finally read the epic earlier this year, and Epic the Musical lives rent free in my mind. But there are countless times in which the characters walk into a lord's home, finding his great hall filled with his people, enjoying dinner. There's even an encounter in which Odysseus disguises himself as a beggar and is welcome inside to eat and rest by his own son. There's a sense of community and coming together that goes away over the century as a more formality is introduced. Soon, estates are built away from being the center of the community in order to provide privacy. More rooms are added, as we see in Heathcliff's description of Freshcross Grange, with Edgar and Isabella alone in a room richly decorated and warmed by fire, whereas Lockwood describes the lack of fire in many of the rooms in Wuthering Heights. In essence, Wuthering Heights represents the old ways on many fronts, from their design on the buildings to how they interact with one another to the way that the children are seen and raised. In comparison, Freshcross Grange represents a cultural shift that would be stemming from more metropolitan or educated communities. This shift includes a more formal distinction between the classes that affect how society interacts and lives with each other. Also, a change in how they see children, but that is a topic I have plans on getting more into in a separate essay. What we need to know here is that tale's old battle between new culture versus old tradition. Getting back to chapter 7, we are witnesses to this cultural push. We see it immediately. Upon Kathy's return, Hindley and his wife are the first to welcome and talk to Kathy. Then Francis directs Nellie, Ellen, help Miss Catherine off of her things. This acts as a reminder of her position in class. She is a servant here to aid, not family to welcome. Although we can see the old ways that Kathy grew up with break through when she kisses Nellie on the cheek. I was all flour making the Christmas cakes, and it would not have done to give me a hug. Another subtle image that shows their differences. Kathy is finely dressed, her hands described as wonderfully whitened and doing nothing and staying indoors, and Nellie covered in flour from working. And then Heathcliff, who stands as an interloper, is given permission by Hindley to greet Kathy. Heathcliff, you may come forward, cried Hindley, enjoying his discomfiture. and gratified to see what a forbidding young blackguard he would be compelled to present himself. You may come and wish Miss Catherine welcome like the other servants. Even the emphasis on Miss Catherine by both Hindley and Francis is a subtle yet equally opaque reminder of Hindley and Heathcliff and what their relationship to Kathy should be. It is also evident of Nellie pointedly informs us that Catherine supped with her brother and sister-in-law. Joseph and I joined at an unsociable meal, seasoned reproofs on one side and sauciness on the other. What other reason to tell us this than it is different than how it used to be? It is not just with the Lintons and Hindley that we see the social divide. We see it from Lockwood at the end of the chapter when he makes a prejudiced assumption of Nellie in her class and community during this interaction. Oh, here we are the same as anywhere else when you get to know us, observed Mrs. Dean, somewhat puzzled at my speech. Excuse me, I responded. You, my good friend, are striking evidence against the assertion. Excepting a few provincialisms of slight consequence, you have no marks of the manner which I am habituated to consider as peculiar to your class. I am sure you have thought a great deal more than the generality of servants think. You have been compelled to cultivate your reflective faculties for want of occasions for frittering your life away in silly trifles. In regards to Christmas specifically, it is a time meant to come together for community, and yet the Lintons only accepted the invitation on one condition. Mrs. Linton begged that her darlings might be kept carefully apart from that naughty Swain boy. And despite Nellie and Heathcliff's attempts to clean up and dignify Heathcliff, he was still violently banished from the room, with this prerequisite that the Lintons are emphasizing not only a separation of the classes, but also assume prejudices based on outward appearances. Sentiments reinforced with Hindley's comment, keep that fellow out of the room, send him into the garret till dinner is over. He'll be cramming his fingers in the tarts and stealing the fruit if left alone with them a minute. All this compounds into the incident, one in which starts with Hindley calling Heathcliff a vagabond trying to be a coxcomb or dandy. Wait till I get hold of those elegant locks, see if I won't pull them a bit longer. This leads to Edgar Linton to interject and say, they are long enough already. I wonder they don't make his head ache. It's like a colt's mane over his eyes. The remark is so obviously said to make fun of Heathcliff. It leads to Heathcliff throwing a pan of hot applesauce at the other boy. And as a reminder, Heathcliff is most likely 13 at this time. And how many 13-year-old boys do we know who are not quick to action? How many are good at regulating their emotions? But besides that, we are witness to the class differences. As quickly as Hindley yanks Heathcliff away for beating, he returns and tells Edgar, next time, Master Edgar, take the law into your own fist. One boy is punished for his violence with violence, while another is recommended to be violent. And even Nellie, who sympathizes with Heathcliff, says Heathcliff's violent nature was not prepared to endure the appearance of impertinence. She assumes because he does not look like them that violence is in his nature, yet does not condemn Hindley for his violence. Instead, she calls it a rough remedy to cool the fit of passion. And to compound all this, when the girls come into the room and Kathy is lecturing Edgar, he lies and says that he did not say anything to Heathcliff, that his mother had told him not to say anything. It's as though he knows that he can get away with making such a lie. Even though Christmas traditions were in a period of transition during the era in which Wuthering Heights takes place, they still encourage community and charity. Yet, during this chapter, we witness the gentrification invading Wuthering Heights, leading to this divide in the community and a lack of charity that would make one question if they are truly good Christians. The illusion versus reality of being a good Christian. Religion is obviously a big component of Wuthering Heights, but also not. Like, it's easy to fixate on the revenge aspect of the story, or even the supposed romance many of us have been gaslit into believing the story is essentially about. However, religion is so tightly woven into the tale. From the strange dream that Lockwood has in chapter 3, in which she's trapped in a church being preached to and then attacked, to the many mentions of being preached to by Joseph. The more subtle conversation I believe Emily Bronte is trying to have is what being a good Christian actually means. It is not Joseph who violently preaches and adheres strictly to the Bible, nor is it those like the Lintons who act like they care about religion, pushing it onto others, and are only charitable in a performative sense. It is someone like old Mr. Earnshaw who saw a starving homeless boy on the streets and gave him a home and a family in love, who did not deem anyone lesser than him, who welcomed one and all into his family. In regards to this chapter and all that around Christmas, I had talked about in the history section about how ministers would preach about charity. In this century, there was a rise in interest in charitable and fundraising events as benevolent societies quartered middle and upper class Londoners with invitations to concerts and exhibition. Further, toward the end of the year, they might pay half a guinea each to hear Handel's Messiah in the Foundling Hospital Chapel or go to Covent Garden and Drury Lane to watch tragedies and farces. Charitable activities extended beyond churches, alms, and sermons in the theater. In chapter 7, this is shown with the carolers. Our pleasure was increased by the arrival of a Gimmerton band, mustering 15 strong, a trumpet, a trombone, clarinets, bassoons, French horns, and a bass viol. Besides singers, they go the rounds of all the respectable houses and receive contributions every Christmas, and we esteemed it at first rate treat to hear them. The point I am trying to make is that the genteel, aka Hindley, his wife, the Lintons, are charitable towards what society has deemed appropriate to be charitable towards, and yet does not expand it to others. It is an illusion of being charitable and good Christians, but does not go deeper than that. We saw it in the previous chapter when the Lintons were quick to punish both Heathcliff and Cathy until Edgar recognized who Cathy was. Quickly, they pivoted and began to coddle her, as though one child was more worthy of kindness and aid than the other because who they are. It also seems as though Hindley has chosen to go in the opposite direction of his father in many manners. Take when Nellie briefly reminisces over holidays past when she says, I smelt the rich scents of heating spices and admired the shining kitchen utensils, the polished clock decked in holly, the silver mugs ranged on a tray ready to be filled with mulled ale for supper, and above all, the speckless purity of my particular care, the scoured and well-swept floor. I gave due inward applause to every object, and then I remembered how old Earnshaw used to come in when we all was tidied and call me a cant lass and slip a shilling into my hand as a Christmas box. We do not hear of Hindley coming to give Nellie her Christmas box. Perhaps, like some of the other families mentioned in the history section, Hindley discarded this, masking it as a willingness to separate the traditions prior to the Christmas ban and to welcome more genteel ones. Perhaps the servants were not seen as part of societal sanctioned charities. With the aid of our expectations around Christmas, the differences and hypocrisy in regards to true Christian values becomes more obvious versus any of the other chapters we have seen thus far. Conclusion. Christmas walks in with all these pre-existing expectations and weight. We expect to see people coming together and being merry. We are encouraged to be kind and charitable. We have listened or watched to other tales in which this time of year spurs characters who reevaluate themselves and change. It is a holiday that makes you think of childhood, whether it is maintaining the magic for other children or reminiscing of your own. It is one of those moments that seems to capture a snapshot of when you felt like a kid and when you felt like you were becoming an adult. With all this weight behind it, Christmas offers the perfect stage for Emily Bronte to use to illustrate and emphasize the themes of her book. Emily Bronte uses the holiday to show how Cathy and Heathcliff are now standing on the precipice of adulthood, which shows also what they are teetering on losing as they are being shoved into the roles society has designed for them. By comparing to what the holiday looked like in the past, they realize how things have already begun to change for them and foreshadows how it will spread beyond just this one day. To illustrate how bite by bite one's cultures and traditions can be devoured, replaced with the new, whether for good or for bad. But also, the holiday comes with more emphasis than anywhere else to be good and kind and charitable to all fellow men. Yet, what happens in this chapter is more commonly the reality. Readers may not even realize she is commenting on the hypocrisy, but the holiday helps to make it a little more evident than any other day. Overall, Bronte uses Christmas as an event that would tip us into Act Two if we were following story beats. Everything up to this moment has been built up, the gunpowder trail has been laid. The inciting incident is Kathy being taken in by the Lintons, and now everything will change. Kathy will be forced to choose her life's path, even though she is led to feel as though she has no true choice. And Heathcliff has been pushed towards his path of revenge as he ends the chapter by saying this to Nellie: I'm trying to settle how I shall pay Hindley back. I don't care how long I wait. If I can only do it at last, I hope he will not die before I do. The holiday acts as the perfect stage to bring all the characters together and the building components forward, to act almost like the big number before the intermission for a musical. And it's only through the close read I'm doing, and because of a comment I had received on my last video, that I really focused in and realized all that Emily Bronte most likely was doing with this chapter, to realize all this weight around her choice to set the chapter during Christmas, to understand more her themes outside just revenge. Before I end this video, I have one more thing I would like to share. In that article I mentioned in the history section, there was a popular story that emerged in 1779. First, let me just preface by saying that while there was still entertainment during the Christmas season in the 18th century, they were lacking what they are deemed as typical Christmas themes in their attempts to separate themselves from the boisterous medieval and Renaissance celebrations. I say this because the story I'm about to share is called Modern Antidote of the Ancient Family of the Kinkwerk van Koto das Sprakengachtens, A Tale for Christmas dedicated to Horace Walpole by Baroness Elizabeth Craven, sometimes shortened to be A Tale for Christmas dedicated to Horace Walpole for obvious reasons. The title's ridiculously long name was a comical invention to be a satire on overly elaborate family lineages. While it has Christmas in the title, it is a tale for the season, but not an example of the season. Still, the reason I am bringing this particular story up is that the contents ring eerily similar to what we will see in Wuthering Heights going forward. In this story, the narrator opens by shortening the antagonist's name into the Baron so that the readers may not break their teeth. They then describe the Baron's manor as being hung from floor to ceiling with ancestral portraits. These pictures represent most of the Baron's society, excepting a distant relative, Hoggerston, who dreams himself a knight, a chaplain, and a beautiful and talented daughter, Cecile. Cecile is a prisoner in her father's manor, for he will not let her marry beneath his ancestors, that is. But when a friend of her late mother visits the manor with her son Frederick Franzel, the two young people fall in love. In the second part, Craven reminds the skeptical reader that there is such a thing as love at first sight. The Baron is not pleased, and Hoggerston is jealous, but Madame Franzel determines to make a match between Cecile and her son. When young Franzel loses his way in the manor one night and accidentally ends up in Cecile's bedchamber, the two young lovers are at first flustered, but soon give way to all their passions. The next morning, Madame Franzel, who knows nothing about the previous evening's encounters between the lovers, proposed a match between Frederick and Cecile to the Baron. He indignantly refuses, citing 500 reasons, 500 ancestors, that make the match impossible. Once the Franzels leave the manor, Cecile becomes as inanimate as one of the canvas ancestors. But Cecile soon receives a letter from Madame Franzel. A personal note from Frederick about their ties falls out of the letter. The Baron is angry and determines he will marry Cecile to Hoggerston. The author interrupts here with, I believe they were the only two men existing who were glad that their young female relation should not be married to a man who had passed the night in her room. Hoggerston imposes himself upon Cecile as a potential husband, but she adamantly refuses. Her father tells her that she will be a prisoner until she consents, so she pretends to do so. The innovative young woman then informs her father that she would like to clean up all the ancestral portraits, but needs a ladder for her work, meanwhile sending a note to her lover about her planned escape. As Frederick waits below, she takes down the paintings and piles them up at the window to give herself leverage, then springs from the window. Craven assures the reader that she is now happy in Frederick's arm. Hoggerston returns to his dreamings of being a knight, and her father, the Baron, continues to be absorbed in the past. But the portraits of these constrictive ancestors turned out to be the physical means of her independence and happiness in the end. When I read this, I could not help but think of Wuthering Heights, a lot of the romantic events being familiar to the events that happened to Catherine the Younger. Heathcliff imprisoning her, her caught between two men, one deemed less worthy than the other, but we see threads of it touching even the older Catherine's life, as she too will face a similar dilemma. This chapter places Kathy on the path of that dilemma. And as this tale was very popular and had come out in 1779, it is not outside the realm of possibility that Emily Bronte would have been familiar with it. It could have influenced her just as easily as Frances Burney's works had influenced Jane Austen. With that, I leave you all this to ponder, and I encourage you to potentially take a step back and wonder, why did the author choose to include something or set the scene in a particular manner? In most cases, there might be a reason behind that choice that could enrich your reading experience. Till the next time, have a happy holiday season, one hopefully filled with more joy than what we saw in this chapter of Wuthering Heights.